Hi, and welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We have a great topic around API security. I'll get to that in just a moment. We're happy to bringing this webinar to you based on the good folks at TechStrong Live, which have DevOps.com and Security Boulevard, and a number of other great platforms for content. So our topic, as I mentioned, is API security. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'm host and moderator. I'm a principal at TechStrong Research, an analyst firm focused in security and application software, digital transformation, and also am CTO for this company that's bringing the technology to the plate. And our webinar today is sponsored by Cloud Entity. We're going to be talking about some research that they actually had conducted. So before we get to the topic and the specifics about it, I do want to give you a little bit of housekeeping information. We are recording the webinar, so everyone will receive an email who has signed up for the webinar. They'll have a link to the recording, and I'll check with, I think we're going to be handing out the slides, which certainly help you get a hold of the report that we're talking about today, which has lots of really good information. If you're digging into API security and trying to think about how do you go to your leaders in your organization and have that conversation, and here's some good data about it, what others are doing, or maybe you're a leader and that might be helpful for you to go to finance and talk about a technology that you might be interested in. So we are doing a drawing at the end of today's webinar, so please stick around to the end and we'll let you know who the winners are for our Amazon gift cards and how to get a hold of those. So let's jump to our topic. We're talking about APIs and the whole fabric of APIs and how that's really changed in the last few years about how we think about APIs and applications. You know, they used to be an exterior component for how to talk to an application from outside sources and kind of get in and outside the app, but it's really part of the entire fabric of the applications. We have API-centric apps that are developed that contain microservices and application logic and sensitive data, of which we're exposing in different ways. And how do we know how we are exposing those, and are they being exposed to threat actors who see that as a high-value target? So progressing through this API landscaping, really understanding how we create modern applications is what we're talking about across multi-cloud environments, and both what the threats are and what are some of the things that we can do to help ourselves have secure software architectures in place. So let's move to, I'd like to introduce our panel today. In addition to myself, I'm joined by Tom Malta. Tom is former head of IAM at the Navy Federal Credit Union. I'll have him introduce himself in just a moment. And then Jason Needham, who's CEO with Cloud Entity, who's sponsoring this webinar today. Jason, do you want to go first, introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Mitch. Thanks, Tom, for joining us as well. Excited about the discussion today. So my background, I spent 13 years leading product marketing at F5. I've done 2 startups, was most recently at VMware, and in the last 2 months took over the CEO role of an exciting little company called Cloud Entity, based here in Seattle and throughout several locations here in the US. And we are working in this API security. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing and why the research kind of ties in, but that's my background. Excited to be here today and happy to be a part of the conversation. So thanks.
Great. Tom?
All right. Thank you, Mitch and Jason. Also happy to be here today. My background is all financial services technology. Grew up as a developer, landed in the identity access management space by accident after 9/11 at Goldman Sachs, and have been there about 21 years now, building out global programs, and more recently have left the practitioner role. I'm actually doing strategic advisory work now for firms like Okta and others, and happy to be here today on one of my favorite topics.
Great. Sharing some of those experiences you've had over a great career with other people. That's awesome, Tom.
And real world.
Good.
That's good.
The real world. We all can benefit from that experience, right? So let's talk about this research that Cloud Entity had commissioned. Now, this is not research that my organization has performed. Just so you know, I'm not representing here as the researcher, but more just facilitating a conversation about that. So this is research that was conducted during September. 300 respondents, for large organizations. So we're talking about people that are very much interested. Of course, we all are in API security, but especially when you get into the enterprise side of things, 69% were directors, managers responsible in some aspect for API development and security, and 84% in North America, 16% in the UK. So good, primarily North America representation, with some representation from across the pond, as they say. So let's jump into some of the findings from the research, and I'm sure both of you will have some insights on this as well. One of the things that the research was trying to assess is really looking at what is organizations' confidence level of their ability to protect API data, API security from unauthorized access, threats, whatever the risk might be. And there might be couple different ways. We say the data showed 94% being moderately confident. However, 85% expressed that their API service authorization policy management practices were decentralized, with only some policy standards that are directly hard-coded into each application. So it's that security challenge of distributed development teams or across different organizations. And while we may be doing things, it may not always be done in the same way, or the policies behind those APIs can often be different or inconsistent in their application. Tom, I'm curious your experience, running IAM and managing security and policies across this. Does this sound familiar territory?
It does, and I'm smiling a little bit because I look at some of the survey results, right? 94% only moderately confident. So I kind of look at that and say, well, the people who are extremely confident, we need to give them kudos, right? Because they're probably some of the leaders in the pack.
2%,
and the folks who actually, and the folks who actually, exactly, and the folks who actually raised, yeah, they're right, they're good people, and the people who raised their hand and admitted that they're not very confident, the 4%, I also give them a gold star because they've stepped up and owned the problem. I think the people in the middle that are saying, yeah, I'm moderately confident, that we're going to be able to address this issue, to me, that's a little bit of saying, well, I'm moderately confident, my wife's going to go shopping and not spend any of my money. That's not going to happen, right? And so I think when you look at how the results then correlate to the maturity aspect, right, where 85% of, the people we surveyed, right, feel that they're decentralized in the way that they're managing APIs. I think that's what's really core at the problem, right? When you look at companies today that have grown up, I'll give you the financial services aspect of it, but it really is any vertical, right? Decentralization can really hurt companies in many different aspects, right? Certainly in the identity space. And when you start to look at, API and API security and how application teams have grown up over the years, right? Starting, going back to SOA and SOAP, was how we started out, where we started to, bring down services and that service-oriented architecture, that migrated to REST. We got into JSON and TLS, and now it's going more to Graph and GraphQL, right? So I think that maturity of that as it came along, we didn't really embark on standardization, right? We continued to have decentralized teams kind of doing this on their own. And what happened is we started to get this explosion now of APIs in the ecosystem that are in different silos throughout the organization, right? Often owned by different teams. There's no standardization on the controls. And when you go into the word control, I'm specifically talking about when you look at authentication and authorization and that fine-grained transactional management of what the API is doing, and not to mention the data underneath it, right? So we've got this whole big ecosystem, right, of potentially multiple different teams out there with different variants of maturity, no standardization, no centralization, right? And I think that is definitely core to the problem, and we need to get away from that. We need to start to doing standardization. We need to start to centralize. So
that's a great point.
Yeah, I think it is, Jason, I'm curious to your perspective, because when we start talking about policy management, now that usually doesn't come up on a single team, right? Now we're talking across an organization, and do we know what is supposed to be implemented is actually happening?
Yeah.
I would imagine, given your experiences working with large enterprises, that's a constant theme.
Yeah, it is. And, I wanted to make a couple observations here too, some of which
Mhm.
pivoted off of what Tom said. If you think about how confident you are, all the listeners, all of us, and the services that we're delivering with our APIs, I think it really depends on who you are too. So if, just thinking back to my own, one of the services that I owned and delivered end to end inside of, previous companies, a pretty good grasp of what the APIs that I was publishing out to the world to share data were, what the data around that was. If I'd been through a SOC or compliant effort to try to bring my service up to snuff, I had to document that to a different degree. I had less confidence around the internal APIs. So there were some APIs that we were publishing internally for our services to talk to one another. So that to me, I didn't focus on. And we learned through a lot of these, I think there was a couple of articles around, zero trust and how we need to think about the internal APIs as well as the external APIs. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. So I think the application owners, depending on where you sit, have a varying degree of confidence here. I think when I talk to the security owners or the folks that are in charge of policy across, the problem becomes, okay, now I have 500 applications or I have 1,600 APIs. And so each one of these teams are in varying degrees of their understanding, and they don't spend their life thinking about security. They're thinking about how to get the application out. And so this classic dissonance between central policy, cloud architecture, security teams, and the delivery teams, the service teams, is tough. And so I think that's one area of decentralization, as we have more and more applications, and each application has 10, 20, 30 different ingress points for APIs, that gets harder to defend. I think the other point around the maturity and the decentralization of policy is that even within the service team, even within an application, I'm actually in cloud forward or modern architectures, I also am becoming more decentralized. So even managing it within one application, there's architectural choices there. So I was kind of underwhelmed with these answers, by the way. It felt kind of milquetoast, right? Like people are choosing the safe answers. I think it's much worse than this. And I kind of agree with Tom. People voted for the middle.
Well, overwhelmingly, which tells me there's a lot more gradation in that category.
Probably should have asked like 5 or
moderately,
6
slightly
questions.
to moderately heavily, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll get a better feel for that. But I agree with you. There's more there, if you will. So let's do that. Let's dig in a little bit more here. So 44% of those surveys, were experiencing substantial API security issues. So it's not something we're thinking might be a threat, but as actually something they're experiencing issues with. Now, it could be lots of reasons around that, being privacy, data leakage, et cetera. And then 71% shared that their organizations had experienced visible delays in releasing new apps and security enhancements due to these issues. So, we're experiencing real things, which might also be part of that. We're in this sort of middle ground of trying to figure out what do we do about these things, because we are experiencing these issues. Now, someone who's a technology provider in this space, Jason, do you see does this reflect customers, prospects, people that you talk to? Are you seeing similar kind of things?
Yeah, I think the API surface is a major threat vector, and I think there's lots of industry data out there, whether it's cloud security breaches from misconfigurations of exposing configuration data to things that are listed here, like privacy and data leakage. Maybe you have overloaded JOT tokens and other things that are being passed around and contain too much information. But I think this is very. I think where this plays out in a lot of the conversations that we have, where data is exposed, there's not as much controls on it. I even heard a story one time with an ecosystem partner where someone that they were consuming data from was handing them way too much information, more than they bargained for. And all of a sudden they took all that PII risk on themselves, right? So you're just making a call and you get all this information back, and then you're on the hook to store it. So it's the issues here around data sharing and the data that is being shared and the conditions around it is super prevalent and super important. And so I think 44% feels like an underrepresentation to me. I think a lot of companies don't report some of these issues.
Underrepresentation, or it might just be early too, where folks are in this kind of that journey as well. I don't know. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, no, I agree with Jason. I think, I'm looking at the stats here again, and I think the numbers, might be a little bit lower than what real life would dictate, right? I think, down in the bottom right there, we talk about, some of the identity and authorization issues, right? I think the thing to remember is that APIs have identity as well, right? And as you start to move from, componentized applications down to microservices, down to APIs, and you might be doing that for a number of different reasons, right? Maybe you're trying to mature your stack. Maybe you're trying to keep up with the open digital economy now, which is exploding, right? Some of the regulations we're seeing, financial services, for instance, where we need to get very fine-grained. As you're doing that, you got to remember the life cycle of those APIs, right? As particularly when we talked about earlier with that decentralization, you might have a team in the, in a loans area that maybe built an API to get basically a status on a customer to be able to present that back to the experience layer. And then you go over and talk to the mobile banking team, and they built a similar API that does the same thing, right? But maybe there's some different controls. Maybe the data is differently being exposed differently. So I think as you look at exposing this outward to, especially when you're externally facing, you really need to make sure you understand and catalog, right, each of those individual identities, those services, and what they're providing, because it just gets to be this, hodgepodge of all these different services out there, and you really don't know where the ownership is, right? And that becomes a really big challenge, again, in that identity aspect of the life cycle of an API does die at some point, right? You might have developed something, again, back in a SOAP architecture now that's not going to apply to your mobile banking initiative, right? And you need to kind of decouple that and let it go cradle or grave and come back with something that's a little bit more current, in the stack, right?
Yeah, I that incidentally, that's where Cloud Entity got its name a bit. I love this point that you're making, Tom, about APIs have identities, right? I mean, the way that we view it is, it's it's all machine identities. It's an API publisher and consumer, and so you have to have a cloud scale approach to kind of validate the data that transfers between increasingly growing mesh of consumers against your published APIs. I'd love to talk about this delay factor too here, the 71%,
Mm-hmm.
before we move on. I think that's also interesting, and I guess I'll just keep the comments short there, is that I think the journey begins for a lot of organizations pretty simply around trying to do some enablement. They're trying to publish an API, and I think that a lot of these project delays that people report to are really that kind of silent killer of application development. They kind of go in, they start building an authorization framework, and then things get complicated, right? The regulatory requirements, the fine-grained policy control that they need. And so I think that's a very interesting dimension that is oftentimes underrepresented at the beginning of a project.
Well, and it's
Yeah, I'd
evolving.
echo that too.
Yeah, it's an evolving landscape too, right? You don't start out with all the APIs you end up with as you evolve and grow the application. It's something that grows and changes with the application.
And being a product
Well,
manager in the past, I think sometimes the business requirements are always not well specified, right?
Oh, no, don't say that. I've never had that happen.
So the developers get the bombs that are coming over the wall with, and do this, and then slowly it becomes a really difficult thing.
Oh.
Well, it's interesting, right? I mean, I think when you look at how organizations kind of got into the API market, right? A lot of it started out, if I go back, 10, 15 years ago, because we wanted to start to share, common routines, common processes across the organization internally, right? Mm-hmm. And so that we started to have application teams, decompose their applications so that other areas can take advantage of those services. Now, in the last 10 or 15 years, right, it's all been about externally, right? Now we're starting to expose services, we're starting to expose things out to the outside world. And the differences there are paramount, right? Because the level of granularity that you need to go to to invoke good security externally is far different maybe than what you needed to do internally, right? Maybe you didn't need to worry about bringing back the entire schema for a payment, even though you only needed 2 or 3 fields, because it didn't really matter. That team would just take what they needed. Well, you do need to worry about that if you're going outside, right? Because now you're exposing additional data that you shouldn't be exposing, right? So I think that's a really key point as well.
I think it is, and also the whole API economy, API centric applications where the application is built on itself, right? We used to think of as APIs as sort of the things we want to let other people use or other apps, whether they're internal, external. Now the UI lives on top of an entire API stack, right? As opposed to being more tightly coupled with the software architecture. So the landscape has changed, which I think is actually speaks well to this next area where what were the contributors to API identity and authorization risks, probably some of those delays we were talking about, Jason. And we could spend, I think, half an hour probably on each one of these. The couple that sort of jump out is the component-driven development complexity. I think it's more than just component-driven development. There's a lot of complexity in apps that we build today, both within the apps, the stack that it's working in, the infrastructure as code, the multi-cloud environment, the technologies, open source and commercial, that we're building apps on. It's, it's gotten maybe easier to create a microservice, but it's not easier to create an app necessarily. So I'm sure you were talking about software-oriented architecture, Tom. How things have changed since SOA.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Just to jump in, I think, to your point about a couple of these causes, right? I mean, component-driven development complexity, I think, is the first one, that's probably the largest problem right now, right? Where I think that when developers start to get into the API world, they don't necessarily understand the level of granularity that they may need to build into that as they're building their APIs, right? They look at an application and a service, they start to decompose that service, they start to build the APIs, but they typically end up putting more things into it than what you would want. And I think one of the first things that I try to invoke on teams is that when you think about an API, just think about it as anything else, right? It's an identity, right? And it needs authentication, it needs authorization. And you want to try to decouple those main services from the API itself, right? Start to again move towards that centralized model, which we'll go into a little bit more in detail as we get through the deck here. But that policy management becomes really important around the authorization. If you start to embed too much of that into the API, now when your business wants to scale, right, maybe you're going to a multi-cloud environment, you're trying to expose that service not just to Google, but also maybe to Amazon and Azure. And now you've got potentially 3 versions of that because you're localizing the administration of the authorization within the API. You want to try to decouple that and centralize it externally, right? I think that's one of the core things that, we try to teach people as they're building, starting to build APIs and especially external facing, right? The other thing I just wanted to call out, I think lack of resources, training, and tools. And I know Jason will talk about this a little bit more. I mean, obviously Cloud Entity and other platforms that are out there are definitely important, I think, as you start to embark on this journey. If you try to take all this on yourself and try to come up with solutions for each of these different causes among many others, I think you're going to struggle with creating standards, creating centralization without having a framework, without having a platform, without having a governance tool to build it on, right? And I think that's really important, and that's probably the number one best practice, right? To start to think small, pick an area, pick a business vertical, pick a business segment, drill into it, right? Understand what you have today. Is it legacy architecture that you're trying to revamp, or maybe you're just trying to build it for the first time? And then start small, right? And then learn your lessons and build from there.
I want to pick at the middle of this, the difficulty to diagnose issues and inconsistency. Yeah. I think, when we hard code policy and, this granular logic into the APIs or the applications, you you get some fracturing with the tools that you use and the policy language. And so it's already hard to kind of understand and really reason about these types of policies and really test them. So I think one of the other challenges is the, just kind of the observability and being able to reason about things. And so if we can move it into more of a policy as code, not just in the way that we manage it and the life cycle of those policies, but also just a way for, not just the developers, but the business consumers to reason about what's being done and test and make sure it's accurate. That's preventative in nature versus detective, right? Like when we're looking for failed logins and some of these other things, and those are some of the things that were discussed, all good things to do, but that's looking at the tailpipe, right? That's not validating the policy and some. So I think these, inconsistent management and diagnosis tools are very important as well.
Well, and it's done on top of a landscape that APIs are not, stoic, right? They change as well. There's versions of them, backwards compatibility issues or not.
Yeah.
So it's a changing landscape in and of itself. So it is a complex environment, and it's not surprising to see difficulty to diagnose issues as one of the challenges, which is of course where you get open tracing and traceability and even that aspect of the industry. So this touches on a lot of interesting topics here as well. Well, let's jump to the next section here and topic about mitigation. So I'm guessing that some of these will be pretty familiar to us. 67% saying, utilizing API gateways and alerting from that. 55 authorization policy and analytics around your allows, denies, and errors. 52% security audits, very common practice for us to do. 48 internal security testing as well, vulnerability checking, things like that, and 47% log analysis. So everything, at least at the top of the list, is on the high side of 40 to 50% plus, which says to me these are consistent things we're seeing people do across all of that. If this what everybody is doing, what's not working? There must be something that's missing or not quite where it needs to be to say there's still a gap. If we're in this middleness of 94%, we're kind of okay with this. We're somewhere in the middle ground. But so many of us are doing all the same things. What's wrong with this picture?
Well, I think this hits on the comment that I just made before, which is a lot of these kind of tend towards looking for errors, in the runtime. So almost it's labeled mitigation, but almost it's kind of coming across as monitoring and
almost detection, right?
Yeah, detection. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. You always need that detective control. But I think one of the things we've learned in cloud scale is that teams drowned quickly with just detection, right? So I think that is where some of those shift left and getting the practices into the DevOps or DevSecOps around how you look at policy, how you control, you validate, test, all those things. I think that because if you do those things, you're putting better water in the pipes, right? Your quality is better. And so hopefully it lessens the noise in some of these areas. So I guess that was one thing I wanted to tie back together is all this stuff is important, but also if organizations feel overwhelmed with kind of the monitoring and using this is a late binding detection. A couple of these all hit on that strategy, log file analysis, all important. Security audit is maybe more proactive. I'm not sure, but the policy and the gateway alerts, those things feel like you're looking for problems.
Tom, what are your thoughts?
It seems, no, I agree. It seems very after the fact, right? In a lot of these points that you're making here. I think that the key that Jason touched on here is preventative controls up front are important, right? Kind of the way that your organization is building APIs, releasing them, migrating them to production, and also out to your cloud services, right? Particularly if you're externally facing and you're enabling out in multiple clouds, right? You kind of have to start in that DevOps, that DevSecOps pipeline. And those are really great buzzwords that we've all come to learn. In reality, though, I can tell you that most organizations don't really have security architects and development security architects, I'll call them, that are embedded in the application development teams that can help people understand that, hey, you know what, you don't really want to put that extra authentication step into that API, or you really should think about centralizing to this service that we created over here. Like the maturity and I guess the awareness aspect, right, of the culture really I think is part of the big problem here, because the application teams who are generally led by business initiatives, who are just chomping at the bit, we got to get this thing to market because otherwise we're going to lose momentum. They're just trying to get it out, right? They're trying to push it out the door really, really quickly. Oh, this great new service that we could release, but they tend to forget about those security controls until after the fact. And this graph is showing that, right? Things showing up in logs suddenly. Oh, I didn't realize that I exposed that additional PII data. I didn't know that, right? You kind of have to get that awareness up front, right, and trying to build it into the teams early on.
Great. Yeah, and one thing that does strike me too is these are things we've been doing for a while. These are not new techniques. Maybe there's, API gateways might be sort of on the newer end of the scale, but the fabric of our apps are changing a lot. So there's potentially a lot of room for innovation, as well as, finding ways to reduce some of that complexity and, not just giving us more alerts, right, to your to the detection theme that you were talking about, Jason. Let's move over to some of the drivers here. Top API drivers. 93% said they plan to increase their budget in API development and security programs. So again, that tells me we're earlier in the cycle, right? There's still build up, more ramp up is something we're increasing and doing more of across our organization. And we had mentioned DevOps and DevSecOps, and I think you had a good point, Tom, that not everyone's security engineers, architects are sitting right next to the software architects. Maybe that's a process that's starting to happen, or conversations are happening as the issue of API security kind of gets brought up. Because guess what? Threats, unauthorized use, data leakage, privacy, you're going to get security's attention when those things happen, right?
Right. Exactly. And I think, everybody at your organization, whatever organization you might be at, in any vertical, executives, leaders, pretty much almost throughout the organization, everybody cares about security, right? And, when you look at, some of the things on this page, preventing threats and unauthorized PI and so forth, it's all about, we don't want to have reputational risk, right? We don't want to suddenly release an external facing service, through an API and realize now that that's easily hackable, right? Because of the way that we built it. If we didn't test it well enough, we didn't run it through the right security process, we didn't really inject it into the pipeline correctly, it's too late, right? So I think some of the things, best practices here is to embrace your business constituents, early on, right? These are the people who are typically asking for that next greatest thing that we want to release to market, right? Whether it's internal or externally facing. And they're going to put a lot of pressure on the team to get it out there really quickly. Make sure they understand that the process of building secure, DevOps, right? The process of investing in governance tools, the process of education, the process of developing teams that are API first aware is really, really important, right? Because if you try to fast track that and you forget about it, right, that's when you end up in the newspaper, right? And I think one key thing, the last point there around data privacy and privacy consent, where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from obviously regulatory controls and things that we've lived with, for instance, in financial services and healthcare for many, many years. But it's actually taken another layer now, right? Particularly in the financial services space, when you look at like what's happening in Europe with open banking, right? And the need to get down to a very fine-grained authorization layer on the transaction, right? And when you think about that, well, that's the lowest level of granularity we can introduce in an API, right? During the actual, hey, I'm making a payment to this provider, or I'm buying my coffee at Starbucks, right? All of that behind the scenes is protected and built around APIs and services, right? And the way that you expose it and the way that you protect it is really, really key. So we're starting to see some of that regulatory environment come into, the United States now, and I think you'll start to see more and more enforcement of that, where the consumers have a choice on what they're allowing people to see, and it's a privacy and privacy consent, talk about GDPR or whatever, but it's all coming from that same drive of that the consumer wants more control of their data. And in order to do that, we need to make sure we've got that fine-grained authorization, that fine-grained management happening at the API layer as well.
I really love those comments, Tom. Yeah, I think you're right on. And I mean, as I was reflecting as you're talking, there's this market forces around really enabling your business and sharing, classic security, and now even more so, user specific privacy, right? And these three things, we talk about this internally at Cloud Entity, is this multi-entity or multi-party sharing agreements, right? It's no longer just what I want to share with you. It's who can access, who am I allowing to access this information through these parties. And I think security condition comes in with like, what are the environmental factors, right? Of maybe when I want to do something or not, but even just the basic sharing policies of what I'm allowed to share and under what conditions and with whom are becoming a lot more complex. So I think it's worth a full stop here to say that most of these, one, it's great news, and we can see the interest in the business investing in API technologies. But a lot of these are, security related. And, on the other side of this, APIs are essentially powering digital business and opening up what we're doing and new commerce channels, API economy. When we've built applications in the past, our mantra is, nothing that we expose in the UI should be direct coded. It should all hit an API, because we don't know how we want to expose the API of all parts of our service, how we want to expose that data to create new businesses. So, my last job, we had 6 or 7 different services that all had APIs that we were gluing together in the UI, and we found business models to go out and, hey, let's expose this inventory data through an API. People would really like to search this information. So I think it's the security and the business, it's the enablement and the protection that are happening hand in hand. And I think why it's the center of investment here for digital transformation. It's like the internet, right? Expose it, but it's got to be secure.
That's right.
Well, and talk about the acceleration, right, to the cloud and to cloud native architectures. And if you're doing more API centric, API economy kind of application, guess what? That all gets pushed front and center now in a climate where, privacy is not only not going away, it's growing in terms of regulatory frameworks and more things that we have to address as well. So it seems like a confluence of a lot of things that's really brought this, to our attention.
Yeah. And one thing,
the other
someone made a comment around compliance. It is hard because you got to govern these things. So thanks for the comments in the chat. It is kind of the meeting of, who can have access, to this information under what conditions, and the regulatory overhead and compliance overhead. It also, makes this costly, and then, actually drives up the requirement on top of all these things that we're talking about to actually have traceability and visibility and reporting, to prove continuous compliance, right? Not just, it's not a state of being. It's, when we're in this rapid change world where things can be reprovisioned and reconfigured in a moment across thousands of machines, it is a continuous job to monitor that you're staying in coherence with those things.
Exactly. Yeah. The only thing I want to add to.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. Hey, Mitch, I just want to add another couple points, if I may. So, because this is a really juicy slide, right? So, I think the other thing I wanted to add is, a lot of organizations now are particularly, multi-cloud, right? And, if you got one software as a service vendor, you're multi-cloud guys, right? And if you take it from a cloud service provider, CSP perspective, companies are now not going all into Azure or all into Amazon, right? They're being smart about it, right? They're thinking about utilizing the cloud in different ways and utilizing the big providers in different ways. For instance, a business area might want to use Google because they're marketing and they love the power of the analytics, while the technology team loves AWS and the level of the resource management that you can do at the finest grain. So what does this relate to APIs, you might be asking, right? Well, if you think about each of these big cloud service providers, right, they each have their own identity access management systems that don't play with each other, right? It's apples, oranges, and bananas, my fruit analogy, right? And you need to be able to manage the security of the API, as particularly if you're exposing it to multiple cloud service providers at the same time. The authorization levels might be slightly different between those providers. So this is another thing that we need to think about as we're building the APIs as to where we're going to be actually exposing that service. Is it to one cloud provider? Is it to many? And you're going to have to equalize the layer of that authorization, which becomes very difficult. But you really need to think through that and get it down to that lowest level. So just wanted to also throw that out there for people who are maybe struggling with that right now. There are definitely ways that you can mitigate for that, right, which is to kind of bring it down to this most common level. And also, as we talked about earlier, which we'll probably get into a little bit more now, is the centralization of some of that authorization processes, right, can actually help you kind of level that playing field. So I think I just wanted to throw out some of those additional points.
No, I think it's a really good
Nick.
point, because you need a framework or something that can go across environments, stacks, cloud providers, and then while you might have central management, you have to have just distributed implementation or enforcement of that at whatever the edge looks like at all those different locations, right, and different applications across that. So
exactly. And it's really hard to manage that on your own, right? Meaning, like, try to do this without a tool, without governance, without a platform, because you're going to have multiple versions of these things now. You got maybe 3 different versions for the 3 separate cloud service providers. And like, oh yeah, well, every time we make a change, we know we need to do it in 3 places. I mean, that just doesn't scale, right? And that's how you end up with exposure and breaches and so forth.
it's
There
not
was a
very
comment.
DevOps either.
There was a comment made about, doesn't adherence to the open API spec kind of solve some of the threat issues? Thought I'd just put that quickly on the table.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, I think Madral asked about open API specifications, and adhering to that, doesn't that help solve some of this? It does from a definitional, here's what the API is and the generation of it and versions of it and things like that. But I don't think that it necessarily helps with, so where are we using that? Who is authorized to actually use that? Not the day we authorized it, but the day 2 when we have to start doing compliance or diagnostics or whatever other challenges, like who the heck is using this thing? And is that a potential either cause or security issue? Things like that. Well, I think so. At least in my opinion, I think open API is certainly helpful from being consistent and defining what you're doing. But there's so many other aspects that follow on to actually implement those APIs. Anybody have any other comments on that?
I think you said it well. It's at the difficult part of applying it, of defining what your policies are, policy definition and enforcement, and really making sure that that's carried through in a cloud scale ephemeral architecture. That's the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Really appreciate those comments too in the chat. Feel free, folks, to jump in if you have any other questions or thoughts. Great. So let's look at initiatives. So the kind of overall 62% were aspiring to improve their API development and authorization governance. Of course, that can come in many different forms. We have some of those listed here. I think maybe Jason, you mentioned, Tom may have also, about zero trust, and there are a number of different sort of frameworks we're thinking about security, I think more systemically across our entire environment, rather than sort of traditional silos that we might have. As we look across these 5 kind of initiatives, anything jump out about what people are looking at doing and implementing that seem unique and interesting here?
Uh, I think overall across these initiatives, we can see pretty clearly that customers are trying to modernize their applications. The discussion around APIs, microservices, east to west, policies code. These are all cloud patterns that really, speak to the modern way of delivering applications. And I think we're very much in the earlier innings with that, with the SaaS transformation, with people figuring out what to how to work with Kubernetes and containers. Um, so it's a very interesting list to me. I'll just pick on a couple of them. The extending auth-in and auth-z controls distributed to an API and microservices. I would say that I have some direct practitioner experience with this and building services for a couple of my previous companies. And I think that 1 and 2 go very closely, hand in hand. As you start to build out microservices, you realize that, all of a sudden you started with a couple of services and everything is cross-talking. And what you realize is that if I have good policy control, not just north-south, but east-west, I get a more secure overall application. But I also get some freedoms for portability, right? I can move a microservice from one area to another, and I don't think we're in the future of like multi-cloud apps yet. But handling policy well and externalizing that from a distributed service architecture is, I think, super important, and kind of is very topical in the industry right now. We talk about authorization as a service. And I think that's what's behind a lot of those trends and development in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Tom?
Yeah, sure. I know. And sorry, the dog barking was me. If anybody heard it, apologies.
Could have been any of
The new
us.
world the new world we live in. So I'll try. Hopefully, they won't up again, and no UPS guy comes by. So yeah. So just to add to what Jason said and some of the things on the page here, I think again, when you think about authentication and authorization, and again, moving down into fine grain, what I'll call fine grain dynamic authorization or just in time, right? I think that's the true nirvana, in my opinion, of getting to zero trust, right? Where you're really granting access, you're granting authority, you're granting approval at the moment in time, at that transaction, at that service, whatever it is the customer is trying to do or the service is trying to do, as opposed to embedding that into, your frameworks, right? You need to kind of decouple that and use policies, use centralized policy management, use authorization, use dynamic authorization as a service, right, to be able to scale, right? And I think, we're calling this out as best practices on this call today, but I really do believe strongly that in a couple of years or sooner, we're going to be required to be doing this, right? A lot of the regulatory environment that we're seeing, particularly in financial services, is going to require that level of fine granularity down to that transaction, right? That linking of that specific thing that you're doing at that moment in time. Do you have the right to do it? Does the API have the ability to allow it? Is really important. I think the other thing that Jason touched on and also earlier, just policies as code, right? Moving to that, I think is really important as you're trying to scale up and look at whatever your journey might be as to moving into API led, right? Partner with the business, pick a small segment of your vertical. You might be saying to yourself, Tom, we've got this mess that we built over the last 10 years. It's all over the place. We've got multiple silos, multiple teams. Okay, fine. Step back, right? Pick a vertical, pick a small business segment. Maybe it's your payments technology area, right? And work with that business and embrace it. Get your teams educated. Get yourself some good centralized tool sets. Build the standardization. Build the controls. Build the security checkpoints in your DevSecOps. And that's your journey, right? Once you get that working, then you can scale it, right? You could use that team as a model for the rest of the organization. And I think that's these are some of the things that hopefully folks are nodding heads and is resonating with the audience.
We have a comment, and then we can move on. It's just,
Yeah.
I think your statement of where we're going is right, Tom. We have this notion that every transaction intelligently authorized, right? That's where we're going. And certainly in e-commerce or other things, APIs are binary decisions. And so you need to insert intelligence. You need to have awareness in that. So that idea of every transaction authorized is, I think, super powerful.
And there's just a add-on, kind of pile on what Tom's talking about. The compliance keeps coming up as a topic here in the comments, and we've seen it in some of the data too. I mean, you can imagine a day where maybe it's PCI DSS or it's a NIST security standard of here's the checklist like we have today of do you have a firewall, do you have a whatever, et cetera,
Yeah.
these policies in place. Will we, or we probably will have the same thing for API security, right? Do you use API gateway? Do you use a control plane across this for authorization across your application? Whatever those factors might be, you can see that day coming. At least I think we're going to have something like
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
It is about having those compensating controls and making sure that they're provable and in place, and just kind of mapping. And I don't think any application or development team is in love with standards. And so, it's a hard thing to kind of crawl through that. So the easier that you can make it, having the right controls and tools in place. Look, I mean, the MITRE framework just attached a cloud security framework for cloud. So I think we're seeing this, right, with APIs and clouds. It's definitely coming where we're going to get specificity and, with some of these standards bodies around the security dimension from NIST.
Well, let's do this. And I have to compliment you, Jason. You've been very well disciplined and not putting the CEO hat on really tight and talking about cloud entity today and just really talking the topic area. But I'd love to give you an opportunity to tell folks really more about cloud entity, what all you do, how you approach some of the things that's come out of this research data.
Yeah, look, it's a fun topic, and we're here to help customers. I mean, we think of this as an authorization journey, as a modern authorization journey, and customers are a lot of different phases. Sometimes it's just trying to catalog and understand. Sometimes it's trying to move towards a more intelligent transactional control model to really enable them to share, the APIs and data, more broadly. But at a high level, we have a platform for authorization and governance, and it is something that works with whatever applications you have. It works in whatever cloud you may be in. It works with any IDP. So we're essentially an abstraction layer to give you this data sharing and policy control. And really excited over the next month, we're going to be announcing our SaaS offering. We've always had something that you can run inside our platform, inside your data center. Will allow you to sign up for a SaaS offering and even run in a hybrid mode where you can have enforcement points. But it's really all about handling this cloud scale identities, from API publishers and consumers, allowing you to insert policies that are very fine-grained and sophisticated in terms of, intelligent and fine-grained. And really handle, I would say that one of the areas that attracted me to come to Cloud Entity, remember I'm just 2 months in here, it's just the sophistication of the data control. So we are very good at handling policies and user consent and really helping, deliver these fine-grained sharing policies, specifically with open finance and open banking, and anyone who's doing an ecosystem play where there may be more than one partners and users and customers behind those partners that they're trying to orchestrate. So that's really the platform in a nutshell. But just want to invite anyone to, if there's ways that we can help them in their authorization journey, we'll very shortly have the SaaS offering that they'll be able to look at a freemium version as well. So you can go sign up. We'll get back in touch with you in the next month as that comes out. And we've got some very interesting cuts on the report, available. So if you're in one vertical, be it finance or healthcare, this information is cut into different vertical reports. So hopefully you find it useful, and love to engage if there's questions.
Great. And folks can go to what's your website?
Yeah, so it's Cloud Entity. So just be careful with the no I. So CloudEntity.com, and all the information. And if you look in the resource section, the report, this and the vertical cuts are available online there.
Great. Looking forward to that SaaS offering too. Sounds like that'll be a great sandbox, as well as sort of freemium you mentioned to give things a try.
Yes. It's all about removing friction.
It is. You have a very good point. Good, it is. Well, we have a few minutes here. We have just a couple minutes. I will announce who our winners are, and then we'll do a wrap up. Our winners of our gift card today, we have 4 of them. It is Jeremiah R., Ricardo C., Pan K., and Mia M. So the good folks at TechStrong Live will get a hold of you and make sure that you get a hold of those gift cards.
Congratulations.
Yeah, good. Sorry, fellas. Presenters are not eligible. So
I was thinking that some of our heavy commenters should got multiple votes in the bucket, but thank you for all the comments online.
They were great, and we do want to thank you. So we don't reward that, otherwise people would just comment the card. So, but how about we give a shout out to Medul? I'm not sure how to say your name. We appreciate your comments, as well as Paul and everyone who has joined in. So let's do this. Tom, why don't you start out with just some parting thoughts, any takeaways from today, and then if you do the same, Jason, following Tom.
Yeah, sure. So first off, thank you guys. It's a pleasure doing this panel with both of you. Really enjoyed it, and hopefully the audience did as well. I think the key takeaway, and we touched on it throughout the call today, is really just to start small, right? Don't try to conquer the world. I mean, if you're struggling with how to get started, pick a small business segment. Maybe you've got a set of APIs in a silo that need revamping. Go out and start there. Work very closely with your business, which is really important. And look for great tools like Cloud Entity. And by the way, if you're an Okta customer, we are strategic partners with Cloud Entity, so we'd love to help solve your problems as well.
Well, thanks for that. I guess my parting thought would be, start with the end in mind. And I think Tom had a great point about, as we expose this data, we're heading towards a world of fine grain and dynamic authorization. And so, this policy control piece is going to be a key enabler to their business, not just a security framework. So I think, think about, where the business is heading, and having the controls and the data in place, or the controls in place for the data. Because, sometimes you have to go fast to go slow to go fast. I think this is one of those cases that when you lay down the right foundation, you can avoid project delays, you can avoid application delays. And, really that's what we're all trying to do, is give our business an advantage. And I think this data control aspect is not just about security, it's about the business transformational advantage that we can get by exposing this data to partners and customers. Long way to say it.
Start with the end in mind. I think we heard that at the beginning and end. So good deal. Good deal. Well, thank you to both of you, Tom and Jason, for being such great panelists and contributing. We're getting comments from our audience, thanking you as well. Just a reminder to everyone, we will be sending you an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as some slides. You can also download the report. We'll see if we can't get that attached to that email too, so you can get a copy of that. But please check out cloudentity.com and find out more about Jason and his company and their offerings. Well, I just want to thank you on behalf of the whole team here at TechStrong Live and our sponsors at Cloud Entity, and also thanking Tom and Jason for being with us today. Most importantly, we thank you for joining us. Our time is extremely valuable. Everyone is super busy. The fact that you would take an hour to spend with us, we're very honored. So thank you for being with us today. You all have a great day. Be safe out there.